Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm good.
Good. Thanks for joining us on Meaning of Life TV. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. You are Rebecca Newberger Goldstein. And you're here because you've written a lot about the meaning of life, actually. You're both a philosopher and a novelist. And your novels tend to involve deep questions about philosophy or spirituality or whatever. Your most recent book is called Plato at the Googleplex, and we'll talk about that. You also wrote a book on Spinoza, the 17th century philosopher, and I want to talk about that for sure. You also wrote a book that we previously had a conversation about on Blogging Heads TV called 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, a Work of Fiction. So why don't we start out with Spinoza? He kind of fascinates me because, you know, there's a phrase that's common now. People will say they're spiritual but not religious. And Spinoza kind of strikes me as somebody maybe you could say that about. Maybe one of the first prominent philosophers you could call spiritual but not religious. He did use the word God, but not in a way that a lot of religious people would recognize, right?
Right. Pretty eccentric use of the word God. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And he was, I mean, by way of background, he was Jewish. His family had fled the Spanish Inquisition. They had been forced to pretend they were Christians. They went to Holland where they didn't have to pretend they were Christians and they could practice Judaism. And wouldn't you know it, their son almost immediately becomes a heretic and is excommunicated at a very young age, in his early 20s, excommunicated from the Jewish community because his views on God are so, and on Judaism are so radical, right? So what was the problem? Where did he depart from orthodoxy? Almost everywhere, I guess.
Yeah, at the time that he was put into what actually in Hebrew it's called cherem, and it's translated as excommunication, but it really means separation from the community. And usually there was just a sort of term of separation, and then you were allowed back in to the community. You did your penance, and you came back in. Spinoza's is the only case on record in the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, where it was just get out, don't come back. We don't want you. And the thing is that he was, as you say, very young, 23, 24, and so he had not yet published, the great work for which we know him, the Ethics. So scholars have speculated for a long time what exactly had he done to so infuriate people. And I have a theory about what he had done, which was that it didn't really matter to him to be part of that community. The one thing about Judaism, and I think it's still quite true, is that the community, is the identification with the community is extremely important. And Spinoza is radical in many, many ways. And in one way, which really predates the Enlightenment by 100 years, and I think really pushes us toward the Enlightenment, he thinks that, the identity that you're born into is not the important thing, the passively received identity, that is just a matter of the accidents of one's birth. We make our identity by becoming rational, and to the extent that we're rational, we all partake of the same identity. A pretty radical pro-Enlightenment move that he makes, but one that his religious community, I think, found quite intolerable.
Right. So he was kind of an early cosmopolitan in a sense.
Yes, he was. He was certainly an early, believer in, that we share the same identity, that ethics comes from understanding human nature. So he does believe that ethics, and of course his great work is called The Ethics, that ethics is derived from an understanding of human nature, and that no sort of supernatural, non-human source is at all relevant to the question of morality. That's pretty radical.
Okay. And his aversion to, you might say, tribal identity, tribal affiliation, does grow out of his view of the universe and of everything, and his theology, if you want to use that term, although many people wouldn't. And I want to get to that. Let's start at the beginning with the way he did use the word God. He's commonly called a pantheist, which means that you basically think the universe is God. It's not that God is a separate thing that created the universe. God is the universe. God is nature. That's I think you have some quibbles about whether he's really rightly called a pantheist, but that's a good kind of layperson's definition of pantheism. He's commonly identified as a pantheist, so that's kind of close to what he believed, right?
It is. It's just that, pantheism often means, seeing God and the beautiful sunset and, the bubbling brooks and the whispering trees, all of that. And Spinoza really identifies nature. What he means by nature is something close to what physicists mean by the final theory of everything, right? That it would be a self-contained explanation. It would include the final laws of nature, what's making the whole thing run. It would also include an explanation for why these are the laws of nature and not some other set of possible laws. And it would include within this final theory an explanation for why these laws of nature had to be realized in the universe. Why is there something rather than nothing? So Spinoza's deep intuition is that there is such a theory. He doesn't know what it is. Mm-hmm. Of course not. I mean, he's a 17th century philosopher just at the beginning of modern scientific theory, modern theory. But he is, he predates Newton. He's very interested in the new sciences, the new physics. But he has this intuition that nothing is really arbitrary, contingent in the universe. So there does exist this final theory. And that is an intuition that many modern physicists have also shared, including Einstein, which is why he loved Spinoza. He actually wrote a love poem to Spinoza, a really bad poem, but it is a poem. And it is, so it's that notion of, if we get deep, deep down enough into nature, perhaps beyond our capacity, there's no, there's no guarantee that we humans can ever get to it. But were we to be able to do this, we would understand why there's something rather than nothing and why it took the form that it did. And that would cause a tremendous awe in us. Actually, even just knowing the physics that we do causes a tremendous awe in us. A kind of, gratitude, awe, the beauty, blah, 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 which which gives some motivation for identifying that with the notion of God. It's worthy of our awe and our, and once seeing it, even seeing that it exists, even without seeing what it really is, but seeing that it must exist, we have a sense of sort of transcendence, of being carried outside of ourselves, and gratitude. That's the kind of spirituality that you get with Spinoza.
So he believed, in a sense, in a grand unified theory, that eventually there would be one, but he believed more that we would know more than that. We would also know the answer to underlying philosophical questions about why that had been, as maybe Einstein or somebody put it, whether God had any choice, put it metaphorically, whether God had any choice in creating the laws of the universe.
But Stephen Hawking puts it really well at the end of A Brief History of Time, when that last paragraph that many people interpret him as being a kind of, real theist in the conventional sense. But he's being a Spinozist when he says, if we were to know that last theory, then we would know the mind of God. We would know why the universe has to be this way rather than some other way. There's a faith here, but it's a faith that the universe could answer for itself. All that we need to really get the final answers is to really understand the nature of the universe, and that and in that sense, it's sort of knowing the mind of God, or it's identifying the universe with God. But it has an emotional, it's interesting with Spinoza is he says it has an emotional effect on us, to the effect of sort of, of awe, of gratitude, of being carried outside of oneself.
And yet you're distinguishing this, I think, from some people who might today say they are spiritual but not religious, and when you ask them what they meant, they would say, well, when I'm out in the woods hiking and I see a waterfall, I have feelings of tremendous awe and reverence. You're saying it's more, more cerebral than that, or there's a more rigorous foundation for the awe or something, but it's not just, whoa, amazing.
Yes, it is. And, for Spinoza, and this is a very Jewish idea, I must say, intellectual progress, intellectual advance is always emotional and, in some sense, ethical advance. We, the more we understand the more we appreciate, the more pleasure we feel, the more we get out of ourselves, the more perspective we have. It's all deeply Jewish ideas as well, as you probably know that in Judaism, I come from a very traditional, actually Orthodox background, as of course Spinoza did. There was nothing but orthodoxy when he was coming up. But in Judaism, the spiritual activity is learning. Is the word yeshiva, which is institutes of higher learning, comes from the word sit. You sit and you learn. So it is this kind of quite cerebral thing. And actually, when you're in a yeshiva, you never go out and look at the sunsets. You never go take a walk, a hike in nature. It's a kind of cerebral thing, and that's true with Spinoza too. But it's more substantive with Spinoza because he's saying the universe is a certain way. It's such so that it contains its own explanation. He calls it causa sui, the cause of itself. The universe is the cause of itself. And that is, if we, just to know that that's the case is a truly, it's a powerful kind of experience, if you believe in it. I mean, Spinoza's he's pretty convincing.
Yeah. And as long as you mentioned your Orthodox upbringing, that reminds me of a question I want to ask you at some point. Might as well take a break here and ask you now. And it is, I read somewhere that you were, quote, a new atheist. You are no longer Orthodox, it's safe to say. But that you're not a new atheist, but a new atheist. First of all, is there any truth to that? And second, what would it mean?
I'm not exactly sure. In terms of, what my view of the universe is, it's probably the same as anybody who doesn't believe in conventional notions of God, who doesn't see a personal force beyond the universe. Maybe that's a way to put, what an atheist is. So,
what about the new part?
I think I think it's meant to. I'm not against. I'm not out to stamp out religion.
Okay, well then you're not a new atheist. You're either a new atheist or an old atheist. Then
exactly.
You
Yeah, I think that there are some very virulent forms of religion. I think, to slide into this question of the meaning of life, I think, that there are various ways that we're very different, we people. We come in so many varieties. And, and I think there is a sense in which we all, crave some sort of large answers. And I think for certain people, and look, they find it in religion. And I can understand that. Maybe that's what makes me a new atheist. I think I have tremendous sympathy for the human condition. Maybe that's what makes me a new atheist.
Well, and the difficulty of being human, in a sense.
Exactly.
And in other words, I mean, people, it's hard getting through life, if you ask me. And it's like, if people have belief systems that help them do it and they're not hurting anybody else, my view is, congratulations, I don't have a problem with that, But I'd like to have conversations with people and push them on their belief systems. I'm a philosopher, right? And I do believe that it is our responsibility
that we are very responsible for our beliefs. We act on our beliefs. We ought to be accountable to others for our beliefs and our actions, but also to ourselves, and that there's a difference between good reasons and bad reasons. And I like to try to push as much as possible towards good reasons. I also think it's terrifically important to be open to changing your mind. I think that's part of what it is to be rational. So any belief system that locks you in, I've got the final answers, and I'm not.
Yeah, but it seems to me that you get a little of that from some of the new atheists in a way. Do you think I'm imagining that? A tremendous confidence that they found a worldview that answers all possible questions.
Well, I think one would have to go on an individual case by case. I wouldn't want to.
And let's don't name names.
Yeah.
Believe me, you don't want to get me started naming names. But let me ask you. There was whether I read somewhere that you said that sometime, I think it was in high school when you started losing your faith. There was some class you were taking on mysticism, and you left. I think you said you left in tears because you felt you had betrayed God or something. But then you got over it and decided you could be a happy atheist. Are you a happy atheist, or are there still like issues where you think, I'd probably be able to handle this better if I could still believe in God, or is it a
interesting? That's an interesting question. I actually started doubting God very, very early. It had a lot to do with hearing members of my family who had survived the Holocaust talking about this, and it set up a tremendous confusion in my head, right? How could this be? I'm named after, a relative who died in a cattle car. It's like, and I was exposed to this at a quite early age, probably too early. Nobody thought I was taking anything in. But so, this question of, how does God allow this started really, really early. And then, at a certain point, probably 13, 14, I read Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian. My parents saw me reading it. They didn't care. We were Jewish. They didn't care if I wasn't Christian. But, he goes through arguments for God's existence and boom, 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 the way I do, a little bit at the end of that novel, 36 Arguments for the Existence of God. Just showing, how all of them fail. And then it was like, for me it was
It was a release more than
it was a release. It was wonderful. It was like
because it had been burdensome to think of a God that you had to please?
A God who would allow my tiny little, my little cousins to die, before I was born. But,
I see.
It was just
it solved the problem of evil.
It did. And especially because Russell talks about the moral argument for God's existence there. The argument that without God there's no grounding for morality, that it's all arbitrary relativism. And he just skewers that. It's actually his skewering goes back all the way to Plato. Plato does that in his dialogue, the Euthyphro. Where he's talking about the gods rather than God. But the structure of the argument works. And I remember that was really like a moment of illumination for me when I read that. It was like, okay, so theism doesn't even help with morality. This is a strictly human thing that we have to try to figure out who's doing it. Oh, moral philosophers, they're doing it. And, given, I was not rebellious against my family. I loved and continue to love and revere the members of my family. I think that also makes me a new atheist, right? They're religious, but they are extraordinary people, and they're not stupid, I can tell you that. I put them up against a lot of new atheists, right? They're brilliant Talmudic scholars, brilliant people. Anyway, that caused a tremendous amount of conflict within me. The conflict that when I was in high school, I learned Spinoza himself had gone through, and that he had vowed to himself not to reveal his heresy until both his parents had died. And I made the same vow with myself, so that kind of thing. But I think there was a sense of betraying my family, my family's history, the martyrdom that so many of so many members of my family had gone through martyrdom, or just plain old, genocidal murder is what it really was. And that caused a kind of conflict. So this was a course in mysticism I was taking in college, and that was the last gasp of my sort of try to be religious for the sake of your family.
So you thought mysticism might be a version of religion you could live with.
Exactly. And I remember leaving, a class and feeling, nope, I can't do it. This is no view that posits a kind of personal God behind things.
So was this Jewish or Christian mysticism, or
it was
both?
It was all. As a matter of fact, the writer who I think made me burst into tears because I loved her so very much was Saint Teresa of Avila. But I remember Saint John of the Cross had a huge impact on me, and then we were also reading Kabbalah, and
so this was mystical experience as a sense of union with a God who's kind of out there. There are other forms of mystical experience, but this is a theistic kind of mystical experience.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I can definitely get into the kind of Spinoza carried outside of yourself, and it is a kind of transcendence, but it's a feeling of awe before the universe itself, before nature itself,
right.
And that is. I'm very given to experiences of transcendence. I'm always being sent off.
I'm in favor of those if I can find them. Now, in Spinoza's view, they wouldn't be transcendence experiences in one common sense of the term. I mean, you often hear transcendence as used in opposition to a materialist view of the world. So it's a whole. In that sense, the idea of, say, a transcendent God is the idea that the material universe is not all there is. Spinoza would say the material universe is all there is.
Exactly.
And yet, within it, you can transcend something. What is he transcending when he has a transcendent experience?
Sort of, it is one's own identification with one's own small little self. So it has a lot to do with sort of identification, that the more, the more you take in of the universe, and your mind becomes sort of, expanded, more in alignment, congruence with the universe. Of course, we are finite. The universe, it says, is infinite, so we can never be a complete fit. But the more you expand outward, in this way, the less you identify with the small, purely personal things about yourself.
So that's more like an Eastern mystical experience.
It is, yeah. In fact, when I was telling, when I first, I'm married to Steven Pinker, and when we had met in about 2003, I was telling him about Spinoza. He said, he was the first Buju. That Spinoza was the first Buju, the first Buddhist
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah, and so, which I thought was pretty funny. But there is a way in which that's true. The difference is the way you do this ascent, this expansion, this getting outside yourself, is through careful, painstaking intellectual work.
Right.
It's not a kind of.
So he didn't have a meditative practice, so far as we know, or anything.
No, it's a kind of if you do physics with a large it's the with the right emotions, and this comes close to what Spinoza is
Sounds
talking.
a little like Philo of Alexandria, if that's not when he describes, he has moments of mystical transport that seem to be more about the contemplation of the universe, if I'm recalling correctly. Anyway, that's like true. That's a millennium. That's a millennium and a half earlier, but
and it goes, of course, back to Plato. Plato himself. I mean, this kind of. I often think that Spinoza is sort of the logical development of Plato. It's that notion of making ethical progress by getting outside of yourself and identifying with the universe itself. Plato comes close to seeing that sort of thing in the Timaeus which is my favorite dialogue of his.
Okay. Let me ask you one more question about this. So I think you or someone, or maybe Spinoza himself, has referred to this as radical objectivity, getting so far from your subjective self that you have a wholly different perspective. Thomas Nagel, I think you may have studied under Nagel, I'm not sure.
Yeah, he was my dissertation advisor.
Is famous for the phrase, the view from nowhere, which is kind of the same thing. I have a question. Is this meant just in the sense of a kind of a perceptual apprehension, or is it also supposed to refer to a moral perspective that would allow complete moral objectivity, would completely eliminate all selfish bias in adjudicating moral questions and so on?
Yeah, I suppose that's the ideal. Actually, the notion of radical objectivity, that was my term. And Nagel has a book, the View from Nowhere, and it's very much Spinoza's idea of viewing things sub specie aeternitatis, right, under the guise of eternity, and which is this, and so it does, and certainly Spinoza thinks it does have necessary ethical implications, because what are we fighting against in ethics? Well, we're fighting against our own human nature. We now know what's determining that. The selfish, the gene. We are vehicles doing the bidding of our genes.
Right.
And it tends to make us, give us unquestionable reasons for acting in our own self-interest.
Unquestionable, at least unquestioned. I mean,
unquestioned.
Spinoza wouldn't say they're unquestionable, but
yeah, exactly,
right.
Unquestioned. When somebody asks why you're doing that, and you
have a reason. You come up with a great reason to be selfish.
Exactly. So, but do we have reason for acting for other people's interests, even sometimes against our own self-interest? This view of coming outside yourself, seeing yourself in perspective, is, or so Spinoza tries to convince us, has to have consequences in terms of how we act.
Right.
So it's
Nagel would have said the same thing, right?
Yeah, and he has this wonderful book called The Possibility of Altruism, in which he argues that, this is Nagel, in which he argues very rigorously for the fact that, for our having reasons, good reasons, grounded reasons for acting on other people's interests as well as our own.
Okay.
Well, of course, we have to be devoted to our own interests. There's again, my Jewish background. There is this saying of Hillel, which I think is of the ancient Rabbi Hillel, very wise saying: if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, then what am I? That's profound.
Okay. Before we move to Plato, one more question about Spinoza. People think of determinism. In other words, the idea that everything, given the laws of nature, everything is inevitable. There's no free will. People usually get depressed by that. But I gather Spinoza had a deterministic view and yet found a kind of consolation in it. Yeah.
His is a very strong determinism. He really basically thinks not just, he thinks logic, it's really, these are necessary truths. The world necessarily exists, and it necessarily exists exactly as it is. The laws of nature are necessarily true, and all that follows from them follows with strict necessity. And yet he's not a fatalist. He believes that we can, in some sense, determine our own actions, that this process of becoming reasonable, of trying to understand things, and understand what is truly in our interests, which is to act in this broad view, to act with a view of sub specie aeternitatis, that he's trying to convince us into this, argue us into this, so that this view will be the determination of our actions. So there's a kind of reconciliation. It's not fatalism, although it's strict determinism. And my students have a lot of trouble with this, and I tell you that there are times when it seems so very clear to me, the compatibilism here. There are other times when it slips away.
My own, well, you didn't ask me my own view, but my own view so compatibilism is this idea that there's really not a contradiction between believing in free will on the one hand and determinism on the other.
Yeah.
I've always thought the only way you could argue that is to define free will in a way that isn't actually the way people are, that makes people interested in the question at all. It's kind of like when Stephen Jay Gould would define religion in such a way that there's no contradiction between religion and science, right? I mean, yeah, you can define it that way, but most people's religions have tension at some point or another with a scientific worldview. So I've always thought that compatibilism was just, you're just defining the problem away. On the other hand, when you do try to define free will, it's almost inherently kind of problematic. It's a hard thing to think about clearly.
Yes.
Which may count against it as a concept when you think about it, but anyway.
No, I think that that's true, and I think therefore, I mean, my own tendency is, let's just forget about that word freedom. Let's talk about accountability. Can we be accountable for our beliefs, for our actions? Let's substitute accountability for the word freedom. That's a very Spinozistic type of move, and I think it works.
Yeah, or you can just say people have to be held accountable as a practical matter, even if it's not just. Even if no one can help what they do, you have to intervene and punish wrongdoers. Of course, when you say that, free will is almost implied because you're acting like you're doing something that will change the way the future plays out. But anyway.
But you will. I mean, you will when you, part of what determines our actions are, seeing how our actions play out in the world, what the consequences are, what that kind of action done by others, what the consequences are. That there is reasoning things out. It changes the way we behave. So both external determinants and internal determinants, reflection, does change the way we behave. So it's and there are good reasons and there are bad reasons, and giving reasons is a good thing. I mean, holding ourselves accountable to others and ourselves accountable to ourselves is stops a lot of very bad behavior.
Yeah. Okay, so on to Plato. So you've written this book, Plato, at the Googleplex, fairly recent book, in which you imagine Plato transported into the future and having a book he's presenting. He's on a book tour that starts at the Googleplex, and in the course of it, he's presenting himself to the modern world, but maybe more importantly, the modern world is presenting itself to him, and he's like assessing it and reacting to it the way Plato would react to it. That's right so far, right?
Yeah. Well, that's part of the book.
Okay.
It's these little dialogues were interspersed in a book that's more expository, that goes back and asks the question, why were the Greeks the way they were? What accounts for their incredible achievements, including, very importantly, philosophy? Why did they come up with this way of trying to reason out morality? So, and they did a whole lot more, right? Abstract mathematics, right? Proof, Euclid, beginnings of science, history as a real study as opposed to just chronicles, as well as incredible art, right? So what was going on with these people? And they did it very, very quickly. In a matter of 200 years, they went from illiteracy to Aristotle and Aeschylus. That's incredible. What was going on there? Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in that, and I'm interested in seeing Plato and Socrates in the context of their society. And in some sense, they were very much the products of that society, but they were also in opposition to it. After all, the Athenians sentenced Socrates to death, right? And, the hemlock. And so there was obviously something oppositional going on there as well.
Right. Now, Plato, when you bring him into the modern world, he's entering a world in which the province of philosophy has shrunk, in the sense that some of the questions that philosophy addressed in his day are being addressed by science. You might say more and more as time goes on. So one question that arises is philosophy headed for extinction, or will philosophy always be needed? And this is a theme that is played with a little in the book, right?
Yeah, very much, yeah.
So what's the answer? I mean, I didn't mention the subtitle of the book, and I won't, because that's a plot spoiler. Why don't you, in this case, it's a plot spoiler with respect to this one question, but why don't you tell us how...
yeah, I was actually going to blurt it out, but now I see the wisdom of your silence. I think that philosophy, by its very nature, will always be with us. That science itself, the progress of science, first of all, is grounded on certain philosophical presuppositions, and that science is itself always throwing out more philosophical questions to us. So the very progress of science, continues to generate more philosophical questions. But I also think that in the sphere of, morality, ethics, all of that, philosophy has made progress, and it's the progress that is often pulled along religion, and that a lot more progress to be made. But many of the human rights revolutions started with philosophical arguments, with philosophers saying, hey, here's an inconsistency between the beliefs you're claiming for yourselves and, where you're stopping short. And so, if you want to say all men are created equal, well, what about those slaves? And what about women? And, so here's what my view of philosophy in general is, and it's pretty much, I was very influenced, as many philosophers have been, by the 20th century American philosopher Wilfrid Sellars. He has an article called Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man. And the view that's suggested there is that philosophers are trying to maximize our coherence. We're very compartmentalized creatures, morally and other ways as well. And that what philosophy is trying to do is to decompartmentalize us, to reveal the inner inconsistencies that we harbor, often because they're very convenient, for us to do so. And that in particular, philosophy is very addressed towards science, in Sellars' view, that it's trying to see, as science progresses, which are the extra scientific intuitions that are ruled out, that we can no longer, take seriously. Which do we need in order to be committed to science? Which are compatible? Science isn't telling us one way or the other. So that philosophers are very much addressed to the scientific image of man, and trying to assess what else about other intuitions that we have, that we use in order to make our lives coherent. What are the consequences for these other intuitions? Okay. And that goes outside of science. It uses science. It takes, what science is telling us, but it's this kind of act of reconciliation between science and the rest of what it takes to be human.
Okay. So, for example, as the kind of biological machinery we are born with, arguably, that influences our moral thought, that influences the way we allocate moral blame, for example, our conceptions of justice, as more of that comes to light,
Yes.
kind of the evolved human infrastructure that seems to be characteristic of our species, you're saying, scientists can illuminate that, but when you ask, well, how should this inform our values? What is the relationship between these findings and our values? That's, by definition, not the job of science.
Exactly. So, for example, as I said, it's impossible now, if you're a scientifically, literate person, not to realize that human nature is very much governed by by our genes, that evolutionary psychology is an extremely important part of explaining. So it can explain our feelings of empathy, but it also can explain our feelings of xenophobia, right? That there are good evolutionary explanations for both. And, so as long as you stay within the sphere of scientific explanation, we're not going to differentiate between, why empathy should be encouraged or, expanded, why it's a good thing, and why xenophobia is so terrible. That it's one we can ground, the other we can't. That is ground philosophically, and the other quite the contrary. To see it is to understand why we want to behave that way.
So by ground, you mean validate.
Validate, right? Good reasons, accountability. Right. Coming back to accountability, right? And so, why the natural feelings we have of empathy toward those of our own kind, if we think that that's so very important, and and we do, and then is there any reason that we should that we can give for limiting it to only our own kind, or if we're going to be committed to those of our own kind, do we have to expand it outward? And so that kind of accountability, and whereas xenophobia, to see it and to understand it is to see that it's groundless, and so.
You see, the more I think about Spinoza, the more appropriate I think he is for our time. I mean, he's a good post-Darwinian. You might if you're not theistic, you might say post-theistic spiritual thinker. I mean, if you look at what people are doing now by way of kind of spiritual but not religious, I mean, a lot of it is grounded in this Eastern mysticism, certain forms of which I think he'd be fine with. And I mean, his insistence on transcending your perspective, your individual perspective, but also whatever tribal perspective you happen to have been born with, seems to me to make only more sense in light of what you just said, in a way.
Exactly. So that this vision is, it's completely compatible with a very scientific view of human nature. And what's so interesting is he got that basic idea that morality is a strictly human affair. And it really comes from understanding human nature. And he even had this notion of konitas, which is the drive for our own perpetuation, for survival and flourishing, and which is a very Darwinian idea. He's like almost, of course, doesn't know the mechanism of it, but he knows that, and he identifies this konitas, this drive to persist in one's own being with one's very identity. It is what makes one the individual that one is committed to this thing's survival when there won't be anything that cares in quite the same way about the survival and flourishing of Rebecca Newberger Goldstein. That's another way of saying, I'll be dead, I'll be gone, right? There is something, and so he sort of identifies that's what individuality is all about. And we have to get, okay, and so that is what makes us what we are. We will always carry that within us, but we can expand outward. That doesn't mean that we're going to be closed in by our worldview, that is conditioned by konitas, by the drive for our own survival. So it's a battle between these two things. Again, a very, very compatible with modern Darwinian thinking.
Okay. Now, when we talked about Spinoza's kind of version of mysticism, in other words, the experience of transcending your own perspective and, deriving some sort of joy or awe or something in further, like identifying with the larger whole, the workings of nature, whatever. At one point you said, when I was talking about one of his precursors, one of his predecessors, Philo of Alexandria, you said Plato, too, in a way, makes sense. And it's certainly true that Plato, that a number of mystics after Plato's time are traced to Plato's influence. I mean, certainly the Neoplatonists, the name kind of says that. But in general, Plato is thought of as having some mystic in him, right? Where is that in his thought? Why is he considered in some ways a mystic?
Mm. Well, first of all, Plato was very influenced by the Pythagoreans. And there it's really blatant, that this was this sect in Italy. And when Socrates was executed, Plato left Athens for 10 years, and he did spend time with the Pythagoreans. And he was very influenced by them. But there it was, that's sort of this view of, by doing mathematics, this abstract, beautiful, formal, necessary, eternal truths. Again, you sort of get out of yourself. It's identifying with the eternal, identifying, with things that exist outside of space and time, and that is something you get in Plato very much. That there is this notion of the eternal for Plato. It's these abstract ideas or as represented by mathematics. Towards the end of his life in the Timaeus, he's really thinking of it as mathematics, and that there's some sort of necessity, eternality there, and
so like the real is like numbers, and
the real is like numbers, right? And the one place in contemporary philosophy where Platonism is still a very, very important view is in philosophy of mathematics, right? There's a view of Platonism that the mathematics describes. It's descriptive. We're not making it up in these formal systems. It's not like chess that we're making up the rules and seeing the consequences of our rules. We are discovering, truths that exist independent of our systems and which inform our systems, but they are not dependent on our systems. I have a book also on Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and Gödel was a very passionate Platonist in math. So this is an idea that that perpetuates this notion of the human mind is able, although we are creatures we are spatiotemporal creatures and mortal and passing. Our lives are brief. We are finite. All of these terms that we're able to sort of grasp something that maximally expands us and puts us into a kind of relationship with eternity. That's a pretty mystical idea.
Well, it is, and I mean his allegory of the cave, I would take to suggest that it's not easy to apprehend the ultimate, the eternal, whatever. The idea there is that our ordinary consciousness is like, being in a cave when the real thing is out there beyond our view.
Yes.
Now, that is mystical in the sense that that's also the premise of, like, Buddhism, that our ordinary consciousness is a delusion, and it's through mystical experience that you start seeing the truth, and through rigorous thought also in Buddhism. So I guess I guess it all adds up. I mean, Plato presumably would emphasize the difficulty, but possibility of apprehending the eternal.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about, for me, the moral downside of all of this, Plato and Spinoza, is the extreme difficulty that they think represents, and maybe it does represent, and that it's not open to everybody. There's a kind of elitism in this.
Certainly in Plato, there is generally.
Why is there ever? It's just out there in the Noble Lie, in his Republic, that look, there are just different kinds of people. And, some can apprehend and make this ascent. And for the rest, we should tell them how to think, because they can't do it well for themselves.
And did Spinoza also think that enlightenment was not accessible to everyone?
Yeah, unfortunately, he did. I mean, it's like they're saying, you have to understand the universe. The universe is extremely complicated. And only certain minds are suitable. Unfortunately, with Spinoza, and this hurts my heart, the very thing, he died young, prematurely. He supported himself through grinding lenses, didn't want to become a university professor. He thought that would impede his philosophical freedom, which is pretty interesting. And so he ground these lenses. The dust exacerbated a precondition, tuberculosis or whatever it was. He died at 42, 43. But, and that's a sad, sad thing that the man died so young. But as long as he was going to die young, I wish he had died just a few days earlier, because he was in the midst of writing a paragraph arguing that women can't do philosophy.
Well, maybe it was after writing that he was struck down by the pantheistic God. Maybe it was a lightning bolt. It was a lightning bolt from the universe. Maybe God's way of saying, "Don't go there." Don't
go there. Yes. Yeah. But it was, so, the notion that this, that it's difficult, that it's not given to everybody, is part of it, and that is a part that I don't like, because it means, that if this is what it is to really behave ethically, to behave with this huge, sub specie aeternitatis, it denies ethical agency to a great number of people. Also, it's a privilege. You have to be educated. You have to have, funds. You have to have leisure. It's a privilege. And so, the Democrat in me rebels against this aspect of it.
Now, I guess this is a kind of a difference with Eastern mysticism in a sense, in that with Buddhism and Hinduism, there is the rigorous philosophical defense of enlightenment and why enlightenment is enlightenment. At the same time, it's very experiential.
Yeah.
It takes a kind of discipline in theory. You got to meditate a lot and have expert instruction, but it's not like taking the SATs.
Exactly. Exactly. And that is a big difference. And, it's a moral difference and, a real ethical difference. And, yeah. So although I myself respond very strongly to this sort of thing, and I've got to say, I'm probably one of the few, I don't live in New York now, but I'm kind of a New Yorker, New York Jewish intellectual who's never been in therapy, never been in psychoanalysis.
Congratulations on that. Have there been times when you felt you needed it, but you didn't want to break your record? Didn't want to break your string?
Well, there could be some of that kind of stubbornness in it. But I turned to Spinoza. In moments of despair, of, when things are very, very bad. I find, he really, I resonate. It gets me out of myself and, puts me into this larger perspective. I find it's philosophical in that common notion of philosophical, right? That professional philosophers often mean something very different from being philosophical. Right, but it does. It sort of gives me that sort of distant, more objective, disinterested attitude toward.
So it's that particular idea of kind of the view from nowhere, or the transcending your individual perspective, that you find consoling or inspiring. Or...
I do. I really do. I sort of see my little being in relation to the whole massive. Everything.
Well, I'll have to read some of his writing then, I guess, which I've never actually done.
And it makes me feel very grateful. It always gives me a kind of
Now that's an interesting thing, feeling grateful even if you don't think that there's a being to whom you're grateful.
Exactly. It is
a non-theistic gratitude.
Non-theistic gratitude, and that's a kind of notion of that. I find, and my students find, when I used to teach Spinoza, an intense course in Spinoza, it was really interesting to watch the transformation of the students, that something emotionally was happening with them, and they would bond with each other with sort of interest because they were going through something powerful together. But there is, it's hard to maintain in the course of pursuing your own life and your own interest. But there is a kind of perspective that comes. And gratitude is involved in the emotion of gratitude. That one is part of being. It sounds corny, but that one has. I'm going to put it as cornily as I put it in my own head, which is that one has had the privilege of existing. Is the emotion that I get, and it helps me.
Mm-hmm. And when you said that, my first feeling was a sense of sorrow that I'm going to cease to exist. So I guess that means I need more work on the enlightenment front. But
It is a sorrow for us. It is.
I mean, it's a bittersweet thing. This existence, this conscious existence thing.
It really is that, we're going to, and and the people we love, we've all lost people we love dearly. Oh, when you asked way back, are there any times, I think, when you said that I miss you said, are you a happy
of religion? Yes.
Yeah. Are you a happy atheist? Do you miss anything? And what I do miss is I no longer give any probability in my to an afterlife, and that is not a sadness for me, but it is a great sadness that the people I love are gone. I think that's such a hard thing to wrap your head around. To love a person is to know what a huge thing a person is. Right? This is, there's such a universe contained in each person, and to love a person is to have such an appreciation of that universe that was that person, and for that to go missing from the world is very, that is, I still find very hard to wrap my head around, and that is sometimes I'll find myself longing that I lost a sister, a wonderful, wonderful sister. I find myself longing that somehow she's still, all of that wonder that was my sister somehow persists in the universe. In that sense, I'm not a happy atheist. I don't.
Right.
Yeah.
Spinoza can't especially help with that kind of thing.
Exactly. He gives us a kind of consolation, but it's a cold consolation when it comes to that kind of.
And it works almost for you better than it does. It works better when you think about yourself.
Yes.
Than it does when you think about the death of others.
Yes, it does. Yeah. I feel like I'm reconciled to my own death, but not so much to the people I've loved.
That's interesting. I can see your point. I mean, the only close relatives I've lost are my parents, and that's a different kind of thing. And to me, what almost matters there is that whatever the truth is, they thought they were going to heaven. That's I'd rather them have thought that than not thought that. Weirdly.
Yes, I agree. As did my sister, who was very religious and had tremendous courage and fortitude in the face of her death.
Well, I suppose that's a sufficiently serious note to end on. But you also brought up gratitude recently, and that's a good note to end on too. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for doing this. It's really been an interesting conversation. I'm sure you're working on something interesting even as we speak, and it'll show up at some point.
I hope it's interesting, but I just have to say, Bob, it's such a pleasure to talk to you about the things that matter. The feelings are definitely mutual, and I hope you will come back when you've either when you produce this next interesting thing or before. There's plenty we didn't talk about today. Okay, I'd love to. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.